Okay, today we're going to explore one of the oddest times in American history, actually. We're going to explore the Anti-Saloon League, Prohibition, Howard County, and the implications of Prohibition both here and nationally. Um, so there have only been 27 amendments to the Constitution since ratification. The first 10 were the Bill of Rights right afterward, and there have only been 17 since. There's only one that has been repealed, and that's Prohibition. Because there was only one that really attempted to legislate morality. And of course, that's the 18th Amendment, the amendment prohibiting the sale of alcohol in America. So I want to provide a little background historically. Some historical context, if you will. So one of the most important social and political movements in our history occurred during the 19th century, but most Americans don't know anything about this or maybe haven't heard of it. It's called the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening was a Protestant religious revival movement, evangelical in nature. There were revival camps all over the country, including here in Howard County. It was interesting in that this was a progressive movement in American politics. The Second Great Awakening led to the abolitionist movement, the downfall of the Whig Party, rise of the Republican Party, women's rights, and temperance. It started in the border states of Tennessee and Kentucky, and it quickly spread to the Northeast, heavily influencing politics. So why did America decide to prohibit alcohol? So hard liquor, distilled beverages had been
Are you
around for a
presenting a
while,
slideshow?
but it wasn't until really the American Revolution that locally sourced distilled beverages were popular or available. Up until that time, most Americans drank whiskey from the British Isles. They drank rum from the West Indies, and they drank brandy from France. But because of the war, trade had to be temporarily stopped, and that led to locally sourced alcohol. So actually, George Washington was one of the largest brewers in America, or distillers in America. And Maryland, Northern Virginia, and Pennsylvania were the main sources of whiskey, and mostly rye whiskey. And you can still get Maryland rye. I believe Kevin Plank's distillery makes one Sagamore that's actually quite good. So it's still around, but that was the beverage of choice. And it was a big deal because um, by the early 1800s, Americans were drinking, if you were age 15 or older, up to 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year. That's way more than we drink today. In the 1870s, the temperance movement was on the rise. And there we go. Okay. So we had the several movements by the 1870s, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and later the Anti-Saloon League. And these were supported by Methodist and Baptist churches, and they were very well-organized efforts to curb alcohol consumption. Some of you will recognize the figure on the left there. That's Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation was really the symbol of the temperance movement. And she was famous, of course, for yielding that tomahawk that you see in her hand. She was from Oklahoma. She would go into bars and basically wreck them, chopping open casks of alcohol and doing tremendous damage to these bars. But it was a religious movement. Carrie Nation, you see she's holding a Bible in one hand, and she was an abused woman. She had an abusive, an alcoholic father and then a husband. And so she made it her cause. And this was a women-led movement initially. That famous line that you see on the left there, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours, was quite popular. And the movement really took off starting in the late 1800s. And all that political pressure really led to the 18th Amendment. It was passed in 1920 with really overwhelming support in Congress. Um, Only Connecticut and Rhode Island did not ratify. Maryland did, but interestingly, Maryland was the only state that really had decided not to take any measures to enforce it. We ratified it, but we did not enforce it at all. And There's also, we're going to be talking a little bit about this rural-urban divide, and that's an interesting one. But really, this also led to a loss of revenue for the state and the nation. Up until that time, liquor taxes were the main source of income for a lot of jurisdictions. And the loss of that really led to the income tax. Yay. All right. So it was a big deal. In Maryland, most Marylanders did not really appreciate this law, especially in urban areas. And remember, this really affected everyone, but especially immigrants whose cultures included drinking. It was part of their cultural norms. That's H.L. Mencken, famous writer for the Baltimore Sun. And that's him celebrating the end of Prohibition. But here's what he said at the time Prohibition was still in place. There is not less drunkenness in the Republic, but more. There is not less crime, but more. Not less insanity, but more. The cost of government is not smaller, but vastly greater. Respect for law has not increased, but diminished. And he was right. This is Governor Albert Ritchie. He was against prohibition, despite the fact that he wasn't a drinker himself. He opposed the law, and he directed state police to turn a blind eye to speakeasies and rum runners as long as they paid their taxes. So this rural-urban divide. So if you think about it, this was a time of lots of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And neighborhood bars are really gathering places for those working class people who came here, primarily in urban areas. In the rural areas, they tended to be more conservative and generally supported prohibition, and they tended to blame crime and morally corrupt behavior in American cities on their immigrant populations. So this was kind of a nativist element that was a part of the movement to keep the ban in place. In fact, this is an article from the Baltimore Sun. The KKK became involved and started to try to enforce the laws themselves. So the Chesapeake Bay became really a hotbed for bootlegging, and this is really because it's a huge body of water. There's a lot of shallow, secluded places on the bay. The state had no interest in enforcing it, so it was up to the federal government, and it fostered a huge illicit industry. Boats would often wait offshore just outside the bay, and then with their fast boats, easily outrun the local or the state Coast Guard and and federal law enforcement boats. So these fast boats led to really the modern Coast Guard with their fast cutters. They realized they needed faster boats to catch these guys, and that kind of spawned. That was one positive aspect of prohibition, is we have the modern Coast Guard as a result. If you want to learn more about it, there's actually a really cool book, Chesapeake Rum Runners of the Roaring Twenties, and you can read all about the exploits of those pirate vessels and criminals who attempted to bring alcohol and successfully did so to Baltimore and neighboring cities in Maryland. Route 1 was actually the top overland clandestine trade route in this area, and rum runners would go use that road to bring alcohol from Baltimore to DC, which was dry. It also led to organized crime rings from New Jersey and New York coming to Maryland because it had these lax enforcement laws. And there's no doubt that Prohibition spawned organized crime in America on a large scale. So here's a little local element that I'll get into a bit. The Anti-Saloon League. So in Maryland, they, of course, face an uphill battle. William Anderson was the superintendent of the Maryland chapter, and he did a good job of organizing and public lobbying effort, and recruited local leaders like the Reverend Henry Branch, who was the pastor of in this very building. Dr. Branch was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church, and actually stood probably on this stage that you're staring at right now, and preached against the sale and consumption of alcohol. Here's what he said. This is from Baltimore Sun. Statement he made: the purposes of the movement is to remove the saloons from Ellicott City. As a non-political organization, embracing members of all the churches, it aims to secure good men as candidates and elect such men as legislators as will favor this end. So that's the Reverend Branch, 1901, who, by the way, I believe is Anne Schoenhut's grandfather or great-grandfather. And you can see his picture in the entryway here. By the way, this is actually right here at the church. They always had all this vegetation around every time, all these photos I see of Reverend Branch. But that's actually what you're staring at right now. So he had his hands full, that's for sure. And there was no local enforcement. All these raids that you see here in Howard County were by federal agents because there was no local law enforcement. And there were lots of stills. There were lots of moonshiners and bootleggers in this area. These are just a few of the articles that I found in the Baltimore Sun and other local papers. So it wasn't that bootlegging was new, but it really, really took off after Prohibition because there was a market for sure, and this was a way to make a lot of money on the side. So a really interesting aspect of all of this is the role of the pharmacies. So druggists were very important during this time, and that's because they could give prescriptions. This is a prescription. This is a blank. This is actually in our collection. And they were allowed to prescribe whiskey to their patients. So Americans couldn't make liquor, they couldn't make cider, or they couldn't make beer. They could make cider and wine, but not hard liquors. So it was a kind of a cottage industry that emerged among druggists. And Ellicott City in particular had several pharmacies and was issued more liquor licenses in proportion to population in any city in Maryland. This is Dr. Benjamin Malore, a druggist in Ellicott City, and a upstanding citizen of Ellicott City. And he was charged and indicted for selling liquor without having obtained a license. And this was common back then. There's the Patapsco Pharmacy. I believe this is from the 1940s, again, in our collection. On the right, you'll see a prescription from the Patapsco Pharmacy. I don't believe, and that is from Dr. Meller, you can see right there. That's in our collection as well, but I don't believe that one is whiskey. But this one is. It says specifically 2 teaspoons full 3 times a day. This was the prescription. It was written by the famous Dr. Bruce Brumbaugh of Elkridge, and filled by pharmacist William Fink. And this is dated January 30th, 1933. This is shortly actually before the law was overturned. That bottle right there that you see is on display, by the way, at the Pew Fulton Farm Museum. And I will tell you that that is actually still whiskey that is in there. It survived, and because I opened that bottle and took a whiff, it's real. So there was a display, and it's still up, and you can see about Ellicott City being a bootlegger's paradise. And, there were conflicting stories about that. On the left, you'll see the Ellicott City residents saying there's nothing happening here. We haven't seen very many drunken people. But yet, on the right, you'll see there was a gunfight after a drive-by. There was a lot of stuff going on here. So I think it probably was closer to what you see on the right than on the left. There's a famous preacher by the name of Billy Sunday. And Billy Sunday was actually in Baltimore, and he did say this: if you want to go to hell, don't wait until you die, but take 15 cents and go to Ellicott City. There he is, Billy Sunday. And he drew huge crowds, by the way. I mean, it's huge. And with amplification during the 30s, even bigger and bigger crowds. He was a former professional baseball player, very charismatic. And he was in Baltimore where he delivered one of his speeches. This is actually, so this is the article. This is a letter to the editor, probably written by Billy Sunday, by the way, but it was unattributed. Here's what he said: bootleggers are thick, while the doctors grow fat and write prescriptions for $2 a throw for a pint of the best, which in turn are taken to the drugstores, which will soon need a regular bartender to fill said prescriptions. So, pretty funny line there. Here's OEC in the 1930s. This is what downtown looked like back then. It's always interesting to look back and see these photographs, because things have changed so much, and then some things are the same. But this actually was the site of an infamous rum runner event. So another advent of Prohibition was the high-speed chase. So cars were getting faster. And the police could not keep up with the bootleggers who purchased expensive cars. And remember, organized crime was running a lot of this, so there was a lot of money available. One of the incidents involved a high-speed chase from Washington to Ellicott City. And then this is from the Washington Post, I believe, or it might have been the Baltimore Sun, I don't remember. Running red lights, ignoring traffic signs, tossing whiskey bottles at the police cars at 50 miles per hour, which was very fast back then. And that's not actually a photograph from the incident, but it's another consequence of a high-speed chase by the police. So some of you may remember this story. It was in the Sun in 2016, after the 2016 flood. A cave emerged under a building on 8120 Main Street, actually. Turns out the cave, or the building, dates back to 1840. It's plausible it was used to store moonshine, but really the original cave was dug in the 1800s to store beer for a beer garden on the site. But it does make for an interesting story. and it is there. And I know, knowing my crowd here, I knew you guys were going to ask me what building it is, and here it is. This is 8120 Main Street. Not sure what that is now, but curious now. I may go give it a visit. That I know what it is and what's underneath of it. Yeah, there was a German beer garden there on the site, and the guy who ran it wanted to replicate the beer gardens in Germany, and apparently used that cave to store his stuff. There was a spring down there too, I believe, that kept it cool. So another aspect of Prohibition really has to do with Ellicott City, and Ellicott City was incorporated in 1867, and it disincorporated shortly before Prohibition ended. So, and it really did that because it was so displeased at the loss of liquor taxes, and moved to disincorporate shortly before that. And even today, Howard County has no incorporated cities. There's no longer a mayor of Ellicott City, although Ed Lilly can claim that title, I guess, but nothing official. So in addition to, so how do people get alcohol? Well, one way were the speakeasies, and these were bars that surreptitiously sold alcohol to patrons. Probably the most famous one in this area was at the Belvedere Hotel. It was called the Owl Bar. Some of you may have been there before. I've been there many times over the years. It's a beautiful bar. And it was known as the Owl Bar because there were two large ornamental owls. The Owl Bar is still there today. The owls are now, I believe, just stained glass that hang from the bar. But the story is that patrons knew that if the glass eyes of the owls were blinking, booze was being served. And if they were lit but not blinking, no, the feds might be around snooping. So these speakeasies were one way to get alcohol. In addition to the rum runners and the bootleggers, and then another way was churches. So federal law allowed churches to keep sacramental wine. And actually in February 1920, two men broke into Grace and St. Peter's Episcopal Church and attempted to steal the entire stock of communion wine. They were stopped by the Reverend when she turned the light on, and they ran away. So that story ends kind of not so not so great. But yeah, anyway, and that by the way is still around, Grace Episcopal Church. If you've never seen it before, it's a beautiful church in Baltimore. So 1933, the 21st Amendment passes. So this is the only amendment overturning a prior amendment in American history. So Prohibition ends. You can see from a headline down there, Governor Ritchie signs the statewide liquor bill. Surprisingly, Utah cast the final vote here. Utah, which is barely is almost a dry state today. I have a friend who lives in Utah, and he talks about it all the time, how difficult it is to get alcohol there. But yeah, they were the ones that were the deciding vote, believe it or not, Utah. So what were the consequences? So there were some positive effects. Alcohol consumption dropped, and it remains lower today than the period before the 18th Amendment. Drinking habits changed. People started drinking more at home or in private parties as opposed to in saloons in public, which was the case prior to that. I mentioned earlier, chasing bootleggers led to the advent of the modern Coast Guard with faster vessels, and modern police force, actually, with faster cars. Negative effects. There were a lot of negative effects of Prohibition. The loss of jobs, entertainment businesses, distilleries, breweries. 75% of New York's budget was lost. Think about that for a minute. 75% of their budget was based on liquor tax revenue. And to make up for that, we have income tax to thank. And that was the only other source of income that states could turn to. It absolutely led to the growth of organized crime, corruption in law enforcement, and the loss of local beers. So breweries survived by making malt during Prohibition. The big ones were the only ones who could do it. So Anheuser-Busch survived, for example, and they survived by selling malt. They also sold hops. So this was, of course, for the home brewers who were making their own beer at home. And they were allowed to sell it because it was marketed as a food item. And it actually led to the malted milkshake, which are delicious if you've not had one. If you remember from, was it Happy Days, the malted milk shop where Richie Cunningham would hang out with his friends. So yeah, that led to the growth of the malt, and and you can still buy malt today if you just want to use it in to make a milkshake with, or make your milk taste better. The other thing it did is these big breweries, they only made two kinds of beer. They were, well, really one. It's pilsners or lagers. And these are the lighter beers that, Budweiser, for example, that are were very popular. And so we lost our local breweries and we lost local beers. And so it wasn't until 1978 when, thank you, Jimmy Carter, that Americans were once again allowed to brew their own beer at home. Then we started seeing an interest again in other types of beers. So if you think about it today, if you go to any brewery, which are very popular, as you know, there's a new one right here in Howard County, Black Flag, out off of Marysville Road. And with home brewing, people started making other kinds of beers like IPAs and porters and Kolsch's and brown ales and stouts, and then of course the local breweries in the early 2000s, late 1990s began to become very popular. Unfortunately, a lot of those local breweries today have been purchased by the big ones, but that's another loss. And as a guy who brews his own beer, that was a big loss from my perspective. So anyway, I'm going to stop sharing now because I'm sure people will have a few questions, and I'm happy to answer those questions, but I'll need somebody to kind of share them with me because I probably can't hear the group as a whole.